AfroLit101 session, and we was going over basically the obstacle. And it's a three-phase premise that we're talking about in terms of the obstacle, the miracle, and the oracle of the steps to start a renaissance. So the obstacle is basically like the intellectual front, contextualizing the circumstances faced by the masses for current or future awareness with hopes of ascending as a collective. And we were basically we're going to go later into the miracle and oracle on a later day, but this is a continuation just after we was able to cut off on the last part of this, the first part. So this is going to be a part two. And what we was basically saying that, the people that we kind of identified as that intellectual front that kind of started the Harlem Renaissance, and it didn't start the Harlem Renaissance specifically, but this was one of the roots of what was bringing about that Black consciousness. It was W.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folks, and the movement by Booker T. Washington. And this is something that we're kind of doing in terms of trying to resurge a Renaissance in the 21st century, is making sure that we tap into those that were starting it in the 20th century. And the idea is to pick up the torch by identifying the predecessors who have theorized what you plan to execute. And the likes of the W.B. Du Bois and the Booker T. Washingtons are the ones that was intellectually trying to bring a level of awareness to those around them and give them some level of contextualization of the place that they was in, and how basically like what W.B. Du Bois saying here, a system cannot fail those who it was never meant to protect, basically saying that America was never, built for their prosperity. So trying to make people aware that through his contributions in terms of his literature and his speakings, and even just any type of, contribution that he was doing in terms of movements, was very essential towards raising the awareness of those that may not fully be able to understand what was going on. And also the likes of Booker T. Washington had a different approach than W.B. Du Bois, but he also had a way of, wanting to uplift others, uplift yourself by uplifting others. So just going into what Passage 3, this is where we left off. And it's basically just getting into the aspect of how these different, dialectics and these different dialogues are very important in terms of when you want to go back into looking, that you can have a level of connection no matter what type of system that you may believe in. And we're going to talk about that now, starting with Passage 3. So, academic and creative offerings from the newly liberated thinkers compounded into a dense ideological framework containing a spectrum of beliefs. The kaleidoscope of stimulating debates and resolutions served as a complex symmetrical structure for those observing in hindsight. So as we look in hindsight, we can see this kaleidoscope of beautiful, perspectives, that were able to emerge about a similar, topic, but now from different angles from the newly liberated thinkers that was coming about in terms of the Renaissance movements and the, transition from being in that slave state to now having the liberty to basically express yourself and being comfortable with that expression, and actually trying to put into implementation of movements that can help you, become your new version of yourself as a culture. So even when natural disagreements transpired, the assortment of styles extending from this healthy dialectic provided a plethora of entry points for future generations to relate. Critics of Du Bois' talent intent concept as a leadership solution, claiming it was elitist and bourgeois, were drawn to align with Booker T. Washington's more populist method of institutionalizing a pragmatic trade-based education as the way forward. So you can see, like, if you are more so along one of the lines of wanting to have like a leadership class that maybe, have to instrumentally bring forth people by leading by example, then you may align with some of Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois' approaches. And even though I think he even criticized some of his approaches later on in his literature, but in the beginning, this is kind of like his concept of basically like having an elite class that was basically going to guide the rest of the people. But Booker T. Washington was somebody that was looking for more of a pragmatic, trade-based education for those that can basically like use their hands and be more of like bricklayers, and trying to use the economic, prosperity in that sense in terms of contributing without necessarily having to have this, basically like boule on top of what you had going on. Basically like trying to amass the people with trades to be able to contribute, and that is another way that he was trying to establish with his, schools and his approach and his writings and his leadership. So domestically, these conversations around united development crystallized even further, resulting in the production of creative vehicles such as the Harlem Renaissance, which articulated distinct experiences through multiple mediums. And this is where we get into more of the creative aspect of what was going on. After they had more of this intellectual front, and people were being awakened to basically like having a mindset that was, aware of what they had going on from studying the likes of these other powerful thinkers, they started to express it in more of a creative aspect, which is really, the natural thing for African Americans to do and Africans abroad to do. It's basically like tap into your actual skill to express your emotion and put some level of, digestibility for people to feel what's going on versus just thinking about it, because that is what I feel like is the difference between the two different things that was in conflict here. Because in the midst of they having a kaleidoscope of black movement, it was against the oppressive movement, which wasn't really allowing for the feel and the humanization to take place. It was more of a dehumanization aspect, and they was basing it in some level of logic or reason that was based in some level of science that they, I guess, constructed to say that they were more than, or, religious situations to where like people that weren't practicing this one monotheistic religion was basically like in a savage state. And a lot of this is what, justified a lot of the actions. And it's more of, logic and false logic, by the way, but that being the context of what's happening, and this heart of a people trying to fight against that, basically like that logic. And this is something that's happening today with the AI and with the internet movement and the technology movement that's taking place. Like there's a lot more people that are having more of a logic based arguments, and people online, especially with the arguments isn't filtered by human to human engagement, then there's a lot of just debates that are happening without any feeling involved. It's really just intellectualism, and it's kind of preventing any real solutions because it's just people trying to have a one up on each other and trying to use logic and reason without actually being empathetic in terms of the other person's viewpoint. And it's really like when you are having these type of debates online, there isn't that human element to kind of bring it and ground it, so where it's just ideas that's floating and there's no real I guess there isn't no real just ability to basically understand how this is harmful versus it being helpful. Like you can maybe express yourself online in many ways, but if you aren't having that human interaction involved with it, or even being sympathetic or empathetic towards that, then you are basically just putting out, fluff ideas that's just based in a random thought that is existing in a space with other random thoughts. And now this environment is just a cloud of different dynamics that people may be just not able to really fully digest what's going on because there isn't a contextualized aspect of what is being adopted. And this is something that's been happening for a while, because even in the midst of what we're talking about here in terms of this journey map, when there is some level of happenings that's happening in South Africa, in America, I'm sorry, they're starting to spread on a global scale, and the flame is starting to be fanned by others that are feeling this same feeling of maybe being suppressed. And there is the music side of it and this side of the Harlem Renaissance to kind of give more of a feel that can be, digested, even if the language even isn't understood. Because that what was happening in terms of South Africa getting a glimpse of what was happening in America in terms of their fight against their oppressive nature of the environment that they was in. And then they saw that they can also have some level of that contribution. And mind you, they also was learning some of the English and the languages that was spoken, but a majority of the people still had their own vernacular. And it was more of the feel that was coming from the musics that was being able to help them basically like see that there was a relation there, and a dance and everything that was happening in the Harlem Renaissance. So you can see that in this journey map, what we want to do is basically like connect with the different elements of where we can, if somebody's reading our output, basically like this article that I'm writing, we want to use this journey map to basically see the different phases that we want to take our audience through, and then make sure that they can connect with the audience and kind of understand the real steps that we're trying to get across in terms of this renaissance, so that maybe they can adopt it and put it into format, whatever avenue that they may have. So in the what you're going to be doing in the second phase, after the first phase of picking up the torch, is fanning the flame. And that's occupying a variety of viewpoints within your collective to spark healthy adversity that leads to growth and complex offerings. Choose important points that galvanize masses to engage. So this is kind of just talking about how, when you are fighting against that logic and reason, that heart to heart exchange is very important amongst your own, but having different viewpoints, because now it builds basically like it strengthens, like, iron strengthens iron, steel strengthens steel. And that is something that, is very necessary in terms of, building basically a real collection of ideas that if you're looking back, like somebody like myself that's in the 21st century can look back at the 20th century and really be informed on the different perspectives and kind of, just really contextualize what the situation was then and how it kind of relates to what's going on now in terms of the pattern recognition that we're able to grasp. And what we're going to be thinking and feeling is motivated, but thinking that internalizing the inspiration through many channels and achieve and alchemize it into new expression that represents a new modernity, and also document the works to create a catalog of the works of his ideology as it has been revised from the predecessors' attempts. So we want to make sure that we're just compounding the wisdom that's taking place. This is a picture of Stokely Carmichael that's having a debate, basically like teaching, in a sense. And basically like I'm pretty sure that they was also, in a sense of having those constant debates and really strengthening, their understanding of what's going on. I think this is Malcolm X in the picture here, if I'm not mistaken, possibly. But in the midst of what is really strengthening the ability to help us in the future tap in, which is a part of fanning the flame, is making sure that you not only see from one side and understand one side, which we kind of addressed in this last article of how WBD, sorry, W.E.B. Du Bois' approach was kind of in contrast to Booker T. Washington, but neither of them was right or wrong, and that's something that is interesting because we don't deal in absolutes in terms of this situation of trying to figure out our future. It's kind of something that you kind of have to do a trial and error phase, and different people may connect with different points of interest. So it's good to just have that full kaleidoscope of understanding to go forward. And we're going to close off today with this last passage of, just speaking about how this fanning of the flame and this difference of different perspectives was also emerging in South Africa as well, as they were being inspired by what was happening in America. So global attraction to that specific ideological apparatus helped immortalize the cultural mecca of America for further replication. The emergence would be duplicated with distinctions determined by geographical placement and political environment, but the core collective approach remained consistent throughout. So this is just talking about, the similarities that was taking place in terms of fighting against the struggle of this environment of being suppressed and marginalized as Black people was happening in both sides. But even if you weren't able to adopt the intellectual side of it, the different type of mediums of it coming through in terms of the Harlem Renaissance, when it was coming in music, coming in dance, and coming in fashion versus just coming from an only intellectual front, it started to allow for a cultural mecca to be replicated in terms of future in other places, but with the distinctions that emerged in their specific geographical placement and the political environment that they were experiencing. So in similarly intellectual circles, the spectrum of alternative perspectives work to stabilize the shared consciousness, preventing one-sided schools of thought. South Africa's mid-century Sophiatown Renaissance exemplifies this transnational inspiration and how its contributions were impacted by the earlier generations' method of documentation. So as you can see, this is going to really set us up for going into the next phase after the obstacle of really understanding what they were fighting against in terms of this, logic and reason, and trying to now have a heart to heart, more of an exchange. It's not only just intellectualism, it's more so coming from a feeling type of aspect, and that's allowing for a lot of people to contribute and for movements to kind of transpire that are being sparking, revigoration in each other. So what was happening in basically like Harlem is being passed over to South Africa, and then it's also like going to see how this is going to move forward in terms of the miracle aspect, which we kind of touched on earlier of the three phases here. And the miracle is basically like worldwide expansion of enlightenment, creating separate societies that may combat similar struggles while choosing distinctive customs over one way. So in the midst of they can go to the process of basically in Sophiatown in South Africa, basically only adopting the way that Americans do it, and trying to really just be that one type of way. But if you would learn from basically like what was happening in terms of the Harlem Renaissance and the movements before that with W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, you will see that it's very important for you to have your distinct myriad of interesting ways of going about your struggle, which is also going to emerge in terms of the language conversation that is happening in South Africa, to where some is encouraging that you do follow the advancement of understanding American language and doing your output, your expression in that language, where some were wanting more of a native tongue to basically like contribute towards what they had, be able to attract more of the people in South Africa to what their awareness of what was going on was, because they were fighting against certain like vernacular challenges in terms of the Afrikaans and British language coming about, and a lot of people was subjected to basically having to adopt a new understanding to be able to basically like even just compartmentalize what was going on rather than it be already being familiar with your natural language. So they had debates in terms of that aspect. So this is something that we're going to go into when we get into the next phases of this article. We're going to have another class on Wednesday at 8:30. And again, this is going through the process of the death, the burning. That's kind of like what we covered today, which is more of the obstacle. And then now we're going to go into the ashes, which is the myriad of expression in different mediums that analyzes the shifts of a marginalized people from one state to another while fighting to survive and capture the emotions involved. So this is what a Renaissance is in terms of the 21st century. It's tapping into the 20th century and really going through the full journey that we're talking about here of picking up the torch, fanning the flame.